topic in. Thanks, Danielle. Recording's just started, so if you want to turn your camera off, then feel free. So Bianca's going to talk to the kind of the concept of scenario analysis and what it might mean.
Yeah. So before we kind of dive in and really talk about like the nitty-gritty of CSA, we thought it would be kind of interesting to go through sort of like a visualization / thought exercise just to kind of put it into a more relatable context. So what we first want you to do is think about an item that you may have that kind of holds significant value to you. And this could be your car, your phone, it could be a piece of jewelry that you find quite precious to you, it could be your house, it could be items in that house. So just have a think about that and keep it in your mind. Now, once you have that in your mind, think about potentially something bad happening to the item. It could be potentially you losing it. It could be potentially breaking it or some other sort of bad thing happening to it. So if you knew something bad could potentially happen to that item, what would you do to kind of prevent that? Obviously, for certain things like your house, you buy insurance for your house. With other things, you just make sure that you take care of it properly. You listen to the care instructions, etc. You store it in a safe place. So that is essentially what a CSA kind of tries to replicate for your business, because it's essentially putting different scenarios that may happen to your business, and then allows you to plan for that to make sure that your business is more resilient and will kind of continue on into the future. So with that, we'll kind of go on and actually talk about what climate scenario is.
Thanks, Bianca. So Bianca's tried to put it in a bit more relatable terms, because when thinking about the future is quite difficult psychologically for all of us as humans, and thinking that far into the future anyway. So one thing we want to iterate is that scenario analysis, so without the climate, is a tool that businesses have been using for decades. It's nothing new. The term scenario analysis in itself is basically thinking about the future and thinking about what could happen and what you can do to either reduce the chance of risks happening, reduce their impact if they do happen, but also take advantage of opportunities. And businesses have been doing this historically to help basically strengthen their business and their business proposition. But because of the natural 3 to 5 year financial cycles that most businesses are under, if not all businesses, it's really forced businesses to think into that short term of kind of how are we going to be impacted in the next 3 to 5 years, rather than actually further forward than that. And with the climate crisis, we know that the impact, yes, there will be some impact in the next 3 to 5 years, but most of it will actually be in 10, 20, 30 years time and onwards. And that's where this kind of short-termism of the financial reporting cycles is encouraging businesses to make bad long-term decisions, both environmentally, socially, and also economically. And this is where kind of in more recent years, actually financial experts have come together, and investors, for example, have come together and brought together the term climate scenario analysis. And what it is essentially stress testing your business for how you can retaliate to climate-related risks, but also climate-related opportunities. And there's a couple of areas in the slides of kind of how they can look around that. But in terms of where it comes from, so essentially back in 2015, or the end of 2015, a bunch of investors and strategists across the world came together. Mark Carney, one of them, quite a famous name there. And they basically realized that this short-term reporting cycle wasn't doing it for them, and particularly actually for investors, ironically. And they wanted to have more transparency over how businesses were preparing for these climate-related risks and opportunities within there, so that they can create resilient businesses and invest in resilient businesses in the long term. And it makes sense, because that's where they're putting their money. That's where they originally wanted to understand the risk associated with that. So that's when TCFD was developed, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We're not going to ponder too much on that today. That tends to be where most people have kind of heard of climate scenario analysis, where it is introduced. But we really want to focus on climate scenario analysis as one element of that, an important element of that. And that's because It's one of the main commonalities between lots of different regulations and requirements that I'll cover in a moment. And also because it can be used, it can be used as actually an exercise that's as small or as large as you can afford to make it. So obviously, the more work you can do on it, the more rewards and the more benefit you're going to see. But it could be a very small exercise as part of your leadership meetings and strategy sessions, for example. So that is kind of where this kind of idea came from, and it became kind of under the TCFD, a voluntary reporting requirement back in 2017. It then became more kind of mandatory in mandatory legislation. So you had the Financial Conduct Authority who introduced it for large listed companies and insurers, for example, over the course of 2021 and 2022. And it's now required for all standard listed companies, also companies over 500 employees or £500 million of revenue. You've then got other geographical areas or countries that kind of introduce this legislation. So, for example, you've got the European CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting, not disclosure, I can't think of the word for it now. Anyway, one of those. We'll send this all afterwards. And then you've got the US SEC who have introduced it now as well. And climate scenario analysis is one element of a lot of these reporting requirements. So if you have to report under it, yes, you'll have to do climate scenario analysis among probably many other things. But we're kind of focusing on it today as not just for those who mandatorily have to report against it, but how it's beneficial for those who don't necessarily have to yet. So the idea around it is to shift the mindset from short-term thinking to more long-term thinking, which is really, really important in the climate crisis and how we think about that. I've mentioned a couple of these already. It's just, we all know it's an absolute soup of requirements and legislations and even voluntary standards. So it's, so you may recognize some of these on the screen. We've got, for example, CDP, CSRD, US SEC, TCFD, some of you may have mentioned. There's also now the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK, which is more related to how companies are going to transition towards net zero, which is a reporting requirement now too. Climate scenario analysis is more of an overarching theme of all of this. So you can't really think about net zero if you don't think about what the future is going to look like, which is where climate scenario analysis comes in. So these are just for reference points to frame the conversation, but we aren't going to go into the detail of what you actually have to do these. We're talking more about climate scenario analysis as a concept today. So over to Bianca, who's going to talk to you in more detail around what those risks and opportunities that we talk about might be.
Yep. So obviously we've been talking a lot about risks and opportunities. And when you kind of answer these disclosures and go through a climate scenario analysis, you will probably be thinking about these as well. So risks can be split into essentially two major types. So what we term transition risks and what we term physical risks. So transition risks are essentially risks that arise from the transition to a low carbon economy. And obviously, when we transition, it will require lots of policy change and legal change, changes to technology, market changes to kind of address and mitigate and adapt to the requirements related for climate change. And essentially, depending on the nature and the speed and also the focus of these changes, the transition risk will pose kind of varying levels of financial and reputational risk to different businesses. So obviously, we've written a few examples. There's carbon tax, reporting requirements, reputation, shareholder requirements, and material demands. So an example with carbon tax is essentially carbon taxes will rise in order to kind of mitigate to help hopefully use as a lever to drive down emissions reductions. But that will mean that if you have very high greenhouse gas emissions, it will increase your operating costs and things like that. So those are the things that you have to think about. And what's interesting is that as transition risk, if your transition risk is low, well, as transition risk increases, usually physical risk will decrease. It's kind of like a very fine balance. Another example with transition risk is to do with reputation. So a big reputational risk is kind of shifts in consumer preference going into the future when people kind of prefer more what we term green products or eco-friendly products. And for companies that haven't transitioned to kind of change their business model to fit this kind of preference, your revenue may reduce kind of due to decrease in demand for your specific product. On the other hand, we have physical risks, which are risks referring to kind of damages and material losses induced by natural hazards as the climate changes. So these physical risks can also be a further split into two types of physical risk, what is called acute risk, which is more event driven. So this is kind of more related to more severe weather events happening. So more severe wildfires, kind of more intense cyclones affecting your business. And then what is termed kind of chronic risk, which is kind of associated with more longer shifts in climate patterns. So increasing average temperatures, sea level rise, etc. And kind of these changes, these physical risks essentially can reduce your revenue due to many things. So it can affect your production capacity due to kind of affecting your supply chain. Other things could be due to like write-offs and early retirements of existing assets just due to the location. They might be where sea level is expected to rise, so you'll have to move. It can also affect your capital costs due to kind of your buildings being burnt down or flooding, etc. And also increase in insurance premiums because a lot of these acute physical risks are increasing, also flooding, etc. Insurance premiums for buildings, kind of items will increase going into the future. And then on the other side of that, obviously, we've been talking a lot about risk, but there's also the other side of the coin, which is why obviously it says risk and opportunity. We should never forget that there are also opportunities in the sector that relate to efforts to kind of mitigate and adapt to climate change. This could be as a result of resource efficiencies, kind of adoption of low emission energy sources, development of new products that and services, that kind of things, and also access to new markets. And then if we go to the next slide, which is about time horizons. So with these risks, we also have to think about the timing of these risks. So when you complete a climate scenario analysis, there are kind of 4 time horizons that you would think of. The first time horizon is if a risk or an opportunity has already materialized. So currently that is occurring to your business. Then there's short-term risk, which is kind of more aligned to financial, kind of your financial planning, usually 1 to 5. And then there's the medium-term risk, which is usually 5 to 25, around that. And then long-term, maybe 25 years and above. And obviously, I've given some examples of these time horizons, but these time horizons are not prescriptive. So when you're completing a CSA, it's very important that you set these time horizons that are useful for your business and your planning. Yeah, so we can move on.
Bianca. So we're going to do a bit of an exercise just to help you kind of implement the concepts. And after we do the exercise, we're going to come back and then share your thoughts on it and see if any questions arise from that. We find the best way to do this is in the actual doing for your business. So we're going to do breakout rooms. I'm afraid some people tend to not like breakout rooms, but we are going to do breakout rooms, a couple of sessions within this to help you really implement it and see how you go. So the first task will be, you have around 5 minutes and you'll be in groups of 3 or 4, and you'll be picking 1 climate related risk to your business and 1 climate related opportunity. So we want you to identify what those are for your business and then discuss them with those in your breakout room, and then identify if they're a transition or a physical risk or opportunity to help see if the explanation has gone into action. So we're actually a bit ahead of schedule, so we actually have time for people to share examples of what they've talked about. But I'll just start off with asking if that brought up any questions, if anyone wants any clarification or anything. Feel free to either jump in or put your hand up. Go for it, Jane.
So I had stepped out to the kitchen when you were talking about the transitions bit. So I was not 100% sure of that and didn't have the slide to refer to. So it would be lovely if you could just give us a very quick run through over physical versus transition risks, please.
Absolutely. Yeah. So transition risks are to do with essentially everything that's associated with transitioning to a net zero economy, or a low emission economy. So they're things that tend to be more wrapped up actually in markets. So things like an increase in regulatory requirements. So companies having to do more around their environmental and social reporting. It could be, for example, the actual transition to net zero. So the cost that will impact, the cost that will influence on companies and the disruption that might cause. It could be, for example, let me think of a third example now. No, my brain's gone blank. I'm not going to do that. So the physical risks on the other side, they're quite obvious ones. They can be direct or indirect. What we find is most of the time people think of direct physical risks. So things like one of their offices getting flooded, or their employees being subjected to more heat waves and being less productive, perhaps, or not being able to get into work as easily. Whereas we have the more indirect ones, which people often forget about. So they're things like one of your suppliers having a storm run through one of their warehouses, for example, and you not being able to get your products out on time, or one of your IT providers having a flood in their server warehouse, which means that you can't get your information from your servers, for example, if it's not backed up, etc. So they're the more kind of indirect physical risks. But yeah, transition risks tend to be more wrapped up in general markets. Hopefully that helped.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you.
What you'll probably find as well is it's really hard to identify physical opportunities. There aren't really any in the frameworks to do that. It's mainly physical risks and transition related opportunities and risks as well. Cool. Who wants to share an example? Otherwise I'm going to pick on someone, I'm afraid.
I mean, we had a great room because we were all in food, right? We
Oh,
were pet
brilliant.
food. Yeah, so we helped each other out. So we had some risks around moving from animal proteins to plant-based proteins, although it might seem great on one side, reducing your emissions, but actually increasing the need for land usage and water and all of that. And then also if you're moving from one factory to another, you might reduce your emissions and your footprint that way because of maybe if there's been a high risk of fire risks or flooding in that area. But also then you're probably increasing your emissions if it has to go further afield to bring that in. So there are so many moving wheels and that we kind of spoke about.
Absolutely, and it's those unintended consequences of moving from one good intentioned action that can have potentially those unintended consequences. So it does help you to think about all of the different moving elements of it. It's very lucky that you all got put in the same room. That wasn't intentional. Who else is in the other breakout room?
I'm happy to jump in.
Go on, Becca.
So we had a mix in our group. So I'm from a product-based background. So we were talking about the risk to supply chain, very much as Joy was just mentioning, the unknown risks to our supply chain in terms of yield and crop kind of figures, how we're forecasting and mitigating for that. But then actually what, as Finn just said, the sort of unknown consequences and of an alternative as well. And then we also discussed sort of more of a DC kind of operational risk, how are we managing those elements. But then from a service-based business perspective, I think it was Will, feel free to jump in, Will, if I speak on your behalf. But yeah, we're looking at the kind of the stakeholder elements as well.
Yes, yeah, we're a service-based business. As you know, Fern, sustainability, providing sustainability, environmental sustainability support for the film and TV sector. So it's an interesting one because there's definitely opportunity there, but there's, I suppose the risks, there are physical risks in terms of, production being shut down in various parts of the world, but they're not kind of, I suppose they're not huge risks to our business necessarily overall. I think the transitional risks are probably more relevant for us as these big businesses try and get their heads around what they need to do, and and the huge amount of, there's a lot of competing stakeholders in our industry, and there's a lot of people that care a lot about public perception and what they're seen to be doing. So I think if we were to be caught up in any risks, it's more likely to be in that area, I'd say.
Yeah, reputational risk is a massive one that people often forget. It's the reputational risk of either acting and perhaps not considering all the elements of it, or the reputational risk of not taking any action, and, for example, still doing things that are damaging to people and environment as well. And that's a massive one, particularly as consumer perceptions change and their demands get higher, and not just consumers but partners and suppliers as well. Brilliant news. Okay, so
can I say that I think there's a real tendency to underestimate consequential risks and the impact of, for example, mass migration on market and market values shifting, and regulations shifting, but they could all teasers because on supply and impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's you're breaking up a bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. Definitely so what you said about mass migration, for example, is potentially an indirect physical risk. So obviously climate migration, climate refugees are expected to increase in the future, and how that impacts businesses and economies. You've also got political risks. So what if, for example, half of the world are on efforts to achieve net zero and half of the world aren't, and they get left behind? There's also things like climate-related wars, which are projected to potentially increase as the physical impacts of climate change could increase as well. So absolutely, I think there's definitely anything that you can make an argument that many things are climate related or will be climate related in the future. Absolutely, that's a good point. Brill. So remember your risks and opportunities, because we're now going to take those through a process of scenario analysis and how they might change. So if any of you have done a materiality assessment, this may be a similar concept to you already. So when we look at climate related risks and opportunities, we need to understand how likely they are to occur, and then when or if they do occur, the severity of their impact. And that helps us to kind of overcome our perceptions around what could be the largest risk compared to the smaller risks, because we all have kind of ideas of what's going to be the most impactful to us in the future, but in reality it can be a lot different when you look at the evidence. So this helps us to kind of prioritize how likely and severe the risks and opportunities are going to be. So likelihood is basically how likely it is that something's going to occur. So, for example, we've just made it simple for this session, and this actually tends to be what a lot of companies do when they do climate scenario analysis, is they keep it simple and have unlikely, fairly likely, highly likely. And that could be, so for example, if I get in a car at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, it's unlikely I'm going to hit traffic. But if I get in a car at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, it's fairly likely I'll hit traffic. But if I'm getting in my car at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. on a Friday, I will hit traffic and need to account for more time for my journey. So they're more relative scales of how likely something is to occur in the first place. We've then got severity. So severity is quite a hard one to get your head around for opportunities, because psychologically, when we think as humans, we can imagine losing something that we already have, aka from risks, but we struggle to understand the concept of gaining things, aka opportunities. So you need to think about it both ways here. So severity, so you've got, for example, on the lower end, that business function is slightly impacted by climate change or the climate related risk or opportunity, or you have a slight kind of positive progress towards that. So for example, for a service-based company, you have a slight increase in your market related to sustainability, climate change, whatever it is. You've then got kind of more of a middle ground. So there is a significant loss or gain in revenue or profits as a result of that risk or opportunity. But perhaps from an outsider's perspective, you'd notice it, but it wouldn't be anything concerning or anything too positive to think about. You've then got the highest end. So for risks, you're really thinking about a risk to business survival. So your business can't thrive anymore, it can't even keep up anymore, and there's therefore severe risks around that. There's then on the opposite side of things, the opportunities. So you're massively exceeding all of your targets and goals around your kind of, I don't know, increased market in one sector or transition to another sector or industry. So you're going to go into other breakout rooms as well. And you'll have 5 minutes again to identify for your risk and your opportunity, how likely it is to occur and then how severe it is. And we're thinking about current day at the moment. We're not thinking about the future at the moment. We're thinking about current day. So today, how likely is that risk for your business and how severe could it be if it happened? Has anyone got any questions on that before we go into breakout rooms? No. Brill. Send them away then, Daniel. You guys are back early. But we can't hear you, Alex.
Somebody is, I think they're just away from their computer, and then Shankar was having internet trouble, so it's me and him talking, and then so
It's not working.
as well. Talk to you guys.
You tried.
Yeah, we tried.
Real. Welcome back, everyone. Has anyone got any thoughts they want to share? Any questions that came up, or what they kind of found out from the likelihood and severity compared to what they originally thought?
We had an interesting thought, I suppose, which was that we looked at an opportunity. So we're talking about the food sector, right? Of various different flavors of food, but we were talking about the food sector, and we're talking about regenerative agriculture as being an opportunity, but that brings with it, like, when you're looking at the likelihood, it's very easy to say, right, you can say what's the likelihood of us doing this and how it's going to work, fine. Then you look at the severity, and one of our group was thinking on what's the negative severity, and I was looking at what's the sort of the positive side of that severity thing, and neither of us had considered that actually there's both until we both started talking about it. And so it's that understanding, I suppose, that once you've got your likelihood of the thing happening, then it's not just a negative and it's not just a positive, but it's both things at the same time, depending on the framing in which you look at it.
Absolutely, Jane. Yeah, I'm so glad that you guys have brought that up without me having to. So it's special to think for yourself. And absolutely. And also, did you find that a lot of it will depend on how you respond to that kind of issue, so to speak, as to whether it's a risk or an opportunity?
Kind of, but kind of not. So we're talking about regenerative agriculture, right? And the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about that is not only is it's not easy to source, but it's also expensive. So you've got costs there. But when you look at it in the long term, you're looking at it having massive sustainable business benefits. If you're already into regenerative agriculture, you've got more sustainability within your supply chain, not just in terms of it, being green and fluffy and lovely, but also hopefully being more resilient. So you've got both that kind of, it might cost more, but it's probably going to be better in the long run in lots of ways.
Yeah.
So both things coexist at the same time, which is a bit, it messed with our heads a little bit to start with.
Yeah, it can be a maze, and it's helpful. A lot of companies have the dual risk and opportunity for certain elements, and they actually have kind of, I guess, a line for each. They separate them for those purposes, but they still acknowledge both of them in their own right. And you can have kind of strands coming off from that. So you can have, obviously, regen agriculture can be one vein, but then obviously you've got, for example, the reputational opportunity of doing that and the potential opportunity around new markets for that. So yeah, it's a kind of a fine line between creating the details that you're very clear on what your risks and opportunities are, but capturing everything all in one. It does get quite spaghetti-like and all over the place. Super. Has anyone else got any thoughts? Okay, bro. So we're going to move on with the same risk and opportunity that you've got already, but the next exercise is thinking about the future. So you've done it in your kind of current baseline, but we need to think about the future and how that might change. So this is kind of where the fun bit and imaginative bit comes in. So most of the, well, all of the guidance around climate scenario analysis recommends that you look at least 2 different scenarios for what the future might look like to help stress test your business across each of them, just to kind of create a range of different possibilities. And the guidance recommends that you look at a kind of a scenario where we achieve net zero and temperature increase is quite low, but also a scenario where we don't achieve our net zero targets, and therefore the physical risks of climate change are higher than if we do achieve net zero. So we kind of kept it a bit more simple for this, but there are so many models and scenarios and data sets out there from scientists and governmental organisations and industry bodies on this. So for example, Jane, you might find, I think for the food sector, they've got their own scenario and different pathways on that, which you'll probably want to look at. We've chosen ones from the International Energy Agency because they're one of the most universal, and they cover all sorts of different areas, and you can kind of take, most businesses can find some sort of element that they can relate to in what the information they have. So we're going to be thinking about the net zero scenario and the stated policy scenario. And the main differences between them is obviously for net zero, we achieve net zero at a global level by 2050, and that leads to around 1.7 degree warming above pre-industrial levels. I think we're about 1.4, 1.5 at the moment. So that's the sort of difference that we're talking about. So still an increase in temperature. So with that, we still have, for example, drought is 2.4 times more likely in that particular model. You've got 13% more intense cyclones. So there's still physical risks associated with that compared to current day. So don't forget that just because we achieve net zero doesn't mean there's not going to be physical risks. But on the other hand, what you'll find, and this is what Bianca was touching on earlier, is that the transition risks and opportunities will likely be higher in this scenario. So, for example, the IEA predicts that there will be in this scenario 3 times more spend on clean energy and infrastructure by 2030, a 50% increase in energy demand in emerging economies. So that's presenting a kind of divide between perhaps what we perceive to be in the Western world. It's actually more focused on the fact that there are a lot of countries that still need to develop and grow to get there, and as part of a just transition we need to allow that and enable that. So it includes that as well. It also includes more obviously job creation in the green sector, which could be related to one of your opportunities. It's you need strong international cooperation to make that net zero target happen. So that's where the political elements come in. There might be alternative fuels and carbon capture and storage that we rely on. High-speed rail replaces regional flights, for example, because it's more accessible, more easy, and quicker to do. And then you've got, for example, on there that under that scenario, they've said we need to phase out fossil fuel cars from 2035 on a global level, not just in the UK. So in the UK, it would actually be sooner than that. So that's the sort of setting the scene around the net zero. Compared to that, we have what the IEA call the stated policy scenario. And this scenario basically outlines everything that governments have committed to in policy, but it doesn't take for granted that they're actually going to achieve their international targets. So, for example, we know that the UK government has a 2050 net zero target. What they've done in this scenario is they've basically taken all of the policies that are actually currently in place and all the initiatives that are in place, and they've basically said, if these were all implemented, what would the output be like? So it's more presenting the gap between stated policies and net zero, where the difference is. So that's, for example, there's potentially, because of that, there's disparities in energy access. There's an over-reliance on carbon capture and storage to capture those emissions that we're not avoiding in the first place. You find that in that scenario, emerging and developing economies increase their emissions to 2050. And I think, Jane, you touched on this with kind of moving your production elsewhere. It might not necessarily have always the best consequences. But there still will be increase in renewables. We still will have to take action to actually reduce our emissions. This is not kind of the easy route, but we still achieve a 2.6 degree warming from pre-industrial levels based on that. What you've also got is that the physical risks predicted to be much larger, even compared to the net zero. So you've got drought is 4 times more likely, and then 30% more intense cyclones as a result. So those are just a few examples, and you can kind of expand on that. And this is just to give you a bit of inspiration for the exercise. But now what we're going to do is send you back into your breakout rooms. You have 10 minutes this time, but what I want you to do is go through the same likelihood and severity exercise, but for the different scenarios. So we want to see, what we're going to talk about when you come back is the difference in likelihood and severity across both scenarios for each of your risk and opportunities, and see how that might change. So you've got about 10 minutes this time. Has anyone got any questions before we go into that? Oh, is that everyone, Danielle? I think it is.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, bro. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully that gave you plenty of time to talk about it. It's a bit of a chunky one. Who wants to share what they thought or what came up or any challenges they came up across? Or what was the kind of main difference you found between the scenarios of the likelihood and severity?
Don't all talk at once.
I was sitting in silence until someone pitches in.
Yeah, I had to step out for a few minutes to talk to my son's school, but we got some stuff talked about anyway. So we were talking about regenerative agriculture again, and we were talking about how even net zero looks pretty rough. Never mind the stated policy scenario, which looks bloody rough, frankly, when it comes to things like drought and cyclones, and just looking at how that's going to affect agriculture in general. So we were talking about how we can sort of sell in board language, I don't know, talking about resilient supply chains. And if you don't get into your resilient supply chains early doors, somebody else is going to get there first. And there's only so much to go around. There's not that many people doing regenerative agriculture. There's not that much opportunity for it, or not much, not many people really standing up for it just yet. So you get in early, then you've got your resilient supply chains, then you can afford to have all of this horrible stuff happening on the planet, and a little bit more because you've got more resilience. Your soil doesn't blow away when it's a drought. It doesn't get washed away when there's a flood because you've got the co-planting with it, etc., etc. So yeah, that's kind of where we got to.
Yeah, and in that regen farming piece, the adaptation element comes so naturally. In how that once, and the co-benefits of that is quite a good example of the other positive communications you can have around that as well. And you're completely right in the kind of getting in early and the kind of demand in general from people. So you can think of one example we use is green electricity tariffs. So for example, you may not have solar panels on your, I don't know, office or site roofs, but you may pay for a green electricity tariff, and they should be supported by what we call renewable energy guarantee of origin certificates, or REGOs. Basically, they're a certificate that proves that somewhere in the country that amount of renewables has been produced for you to use. Might not be direct, but somewhere in the country it's been made. And what the forecast is saying is that the price of REGOs is going to skyrocket in the near future, actually. And so if your company, it might be more worthwhile for your company or you to work with your landlord to actually put solar panels on the roof, so that you're more resilient to those sort of risks within that. So absolutely, good point to raise. Okay, brilliant. We're going to go on to questions now. Oh, I think I've not moved the slides around. Let's do questions and I'll go back to what next afterwards.
So I actually have something to say about the last thing, if you're still open to it.
Yeah, go for it.
And that is, I think that through the lens of the stuff that I was talking about earlier, I think that there's like more of a qualitative difference necessary than a quantitative difference in a lot of the impact, because although the ones that are specifically listed here might be exceptions, although not all of them, and he definitely touched upon the idea of justice. Actually, a lot of the interventions that we are proposing, even in the net zero scenario, have a big impact on the global majority. And that then has a knock-on impact that will have an impact back here at home. So in a way, this kind of analysis that focuses on like what are the risks and opportunities for my business doesn't necessarily take into account. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to do. It's absolutely a positive thing to do, but it can't see into necessarily. And we spent a bit of time talking about how we would justify or capture like some of these knock-on impacts, not just of climate change, but the impact of the interventions that we're going to do on global geopolitics or migration or social values or any of these things, which ultimately are still going to have risks and opportunities for our businesses. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that out as something that, you know, qualitative change might not be the same as quantitative change and quantitative risks and opportunities.
I'm very glad you've brought that up. And the reason I like this exercise is because it brings them up in conversation, even though not explicitly, they still can kind of raise awareness. So one good example is perhaps critical raw materials, or for example, things that we need to transition towards net zero. So lithium for batteries and cobalt for solar panels, for example. And obviously, yes, we need to shift towards a net zero economy, but the impact of that, of the extraction of those materials, is on a lot of emerging economies. And perhaps that's often ignored by businesses in the developed economies anyway. So it is kind of about creating your argument for these points and trying to be more holistic around the whole thing. But you've raised a really good point. It absolutely needs attention. While waiting for questions, see if there are any, I'll talk about what next and what you can do with this information, because it's not just about doing the exercise and the conversations that come from it. It's actually about what you can do to either reduce the chance of the risk happening, reduce the impact if it does happen, or the actions you can take to increase the size of the opportunities, or how you take advantage of those opportunities. So there are actions you can do with those that you've identified. We've already kind of gone into solution mode and talked about some of them, but that's where the value comes in terms of actually getting leadership buy-in on the actions you're going to take for this. And the kind of framework around climate scenario analysis historically has been in kind of very much business and executive teams and investor terms. So if you can speak that language, it is intentionally meant to be in that language to get that buy-in. So there is a kind of positive of that. But what we're trying to touch on is that it shouldn't just be a tick box exercise. It's something that can be a really valuable tool and doesn't have to be a mammoth project. I mean, ideally, we'd all be spending lots of time on this and thinking about it, but in reality, we don't have that time. So at least thinking about a few of them and talking about them in your companies is beneficial. So I'll go on to questions. If we've got any more questions, I'll answer them. Me and Bianca will try and answer them, but if not, send them across afterwards and we can share them out and go from there.
Hi.